should just watch people suffering and do nothing. There's no. What decides what a human right is? The West or the international?
Most relative then oppressive regimes can justify.
Should they be declared under universal morality? Welcome everyone to tonight's debate on moral universalism versus moral relativism. At the heart of this discussion lies a fundamental question. Are moral principles absolute and applicable to all people, or do they depend on one's culture, society, or personal perspective? Now, we'll introduce our teams. Our supporting team stands with moral universalism. We have Mark Sidney and Wong Yong Ki, arguing that certain moral principles such as human rights and dignity should be upheld across all societies. On the other hand, we have our opposing team stands with moral relativism. We have Shane Lee and Tiang Li Xuan. They argue that morality is shaped by cultural, historical, and social contexts and cannot be judged by a single universal standard. I'll be keeping time and signaling when 30 seconds are left and when time is up. I call on the candidates to open the discussion. The floor is yours.
So moral universalism holds that certain moral principles apply to all human beings, regardless of their culture or belief. Practices like female genital mutilation, FGM, honor killings, and LGBTQ plus persecution are not simply cultural norms, they violate basic human rights. So if we excuse these practices under the name of cultural differences, we are allowing the harm and oppression to persist. Thank you.
To add to that, throughout history, progress has been made by rejecting harmful traditions. If morality were truly relative, slavery, racial segregation, and child marriage could still be justified. Instead, the world has agreed on universal ethical principles. It is to protect individuals from suffering.
Moral relativism acknowledges that societies have different historical, cultural, and social values. What is moral is not universal, as it is shaped by different tradition, religion, and community values. Condemning practices like FGM or arranged marriages as immoral ignores the perspective of those within these cultures. Thank you.
Moral universalism assumes a single moral standards for all, which is unrealistic. Different societies have different ethical priorities. Freedom of speech, LGBTQ plus rights, and the death penalty are all viewed differently across the world. Who decides which morality is right?
Thank you. Now let's begin with our first debate round. We will start with our first proposition speaker, Mark Sidney.
Okay, so let's talk about something very real, FGM. It is a practice that harms youngers, that cause lifelong health issues, and is often forced on them without their consent. So this isn't just a cultural tradition, it is a violation of basic human rights. There's no justification for subjecting someone to pain and suffering in the name of tradition. So same goes to the LGBTQ plus, right? In some countries, people are imprisoned or even killed for just being who they are. If we say morality depends on culture, then we are allowing these injustices to continue without question. But human dignity should never be negotiable.
But what about cultures that see gender and sexuality differently? Not every society follows Western views on identity. Who are we to impose our beliefs?
This is not about the West, it's about the harm. LGBTQ individuals, they face violence and death in some countries. Should we accept that simply because a culture rejects LGBTQ?
You assume that morality is static, but in many places, social norms evolve within cultures. Change should come organically, not through external pressure.
But how do you justify jailing or killing someone for their identity? Would you have said the same about slavery or segregation, that we should just let the culture evolve?
Time's up. Thank you, Mark. I'll look to Shane to open the case for opposition.
Look, we are not saying harm is okay, but different societies define morality based on their history, religion, and values. FGM, for example, is seen by some as a rite of passage, a tradition that brings respect within their community. Just because outsiders call it mutilation doesn't mean that's how it's viewed by those who practice it. Same goes with LGBTQ plus rights. In some cultures, traditional family values are deeply rooted. You can't just enforce a universal standard and expect people to change overnight.
By your logic, any practice, no matter how harmful, is acceptable if a culture believes in it. So if a culture says it is okay to punish someone for being gay, that is acceptable to you?
Not necessarily, but change should come from within the community, not from external pressure. Societies evolve in their own time. Forcing change leads to cultural resistance.
Well, that's easy to say when you are not the one being oppressed. Should enslaved people have just waited for the gradual change?
Thank you, Shane, for closing the case. Moving on, let's start with our second debate round. I would like to call upon our second proposition speaker, Wong Yong Ki.
Now, for a more common example, freedom of speech. It is a fundamental human right. It allows people to challenge authority, express their beliefs, and fight for justice. In many authoritarian countries, speaking against the government can get you arrested or even killed. If we say morality is relative, then oppressive regimes can justify silencing people just because it's part of their culture. That is dangerous. And what about the death penalty? Death penalty is a direct violation of human rights. It is irreversible. Innocent people have been executed, and studies show it doesn't even deter crime. If morality were truly relative, governments could justify executing people for political reasons for minor offenses. That's why we need universal standards. Human life shouldn't be disposable.
But not all societies view free speech as an absolute right. Some cultures prioritize social harmony over individual expression. Hate speech law, blasphemy law, and national security law exist to maintain order. Would you argue that all restrictions on speech are immoral?
Well, yes, if they punish peaceful dissent or silence the truth, free speech is how progress happens. Without it, women wouldn't have won voting rights, slavery wouldn't have been abolished, and dictators wouldn't be held accountable.
But what about speech that encourage violence? Many countries have laws against hate speech and religious insults to keep society peaceful. If speech is not controlled, it can cause conflict, riots, or even genocide. Does moral universalism support complete free speech even if it causes harm?
There is a difference between direct incitement and offensive speech. Yes, speech has limits when it calls for violence, but governments often abuse these laws to silence critics. In many countries, hate speech laws are used to punish journalists, activists, and minorities.
But cultures set their own moral boundaries. In some places, criticizing religion is seen as deeply offensive and dangerous. You say free speech is universal, but not all societies value individualism over collective respect.
Shouldn't people have the right to question their own traditions? A law that punishes blasphemy or protest is not about morality. It's about controlling power. You're not protecting culture. You're protecting authoritarianism.
Thank you, Wong. Now, I would like to call upon the second opposition speaker, Tiang Li Xuan.
The death penalty is widely accepted in many cultures as a just punishment for the most heinous crimes. Society that practice capital punishment believe in retributive justice. Why should one set of moral values overrule another? And some crimes like terrorism, mass murder, child abuse are so severe that a society might see execution as necessary. Your stance ignores cultural beliefs about justice, retribution, and closure for victims' family.
But studies show that death penalty doesn't deter crime. What happens when an innocent people is executed? Should the government be allowed to play judge, jury, and the executioner?
Every justice system has flaws. Different cultures have different ways of handling justice, and it is not up to outsiders to dictate their laws.
This isn't about outsiders. It's about universal human dignity. Even if someone commits a terrible crime, who gives the state the right to kill? Morality must be about rehabilitation, not vengeance.
Not all cultures believe in rehabilitation over punishment. Some societies prioritize retributive justice. A murderer takes a life, and they must forfeit their own. You assume all moral systems should be based on Western ideas of justice.
This isn't just a Western argument. Many countries abolished the death penalty because they realized it was unjust. You're defending a system that has led to wrongful executions, racial bias, and political killings.
But in some countries, the death penalty is reserved for the worst criminals like terrorists, serial killers. Should that be spared under a universal morality that ignores what the society deems just?
Yes, even criminals have rights. If morality is based on revenge, we have no moral progress. The death penalty is state-sanctioned murder, no matter how you justify it.
Thank you. We will now take a short 3 minutes break before we enter into our free debate session. We will now move into our free debate session. Each side may challenge, question, and rebut their opponents freely. I will ensure fairness, but interruptions are allowed within reason. The floor is open.
Okay, so I want to bring back to something very simple. How do you justify harmful practices just because the culture believes in them?
We are not justifying harm, we are arguing that each society determines its own ethical boundaries. What seems harmful from the outside may have deep cultural significance to the people within.
Well, let's be direct. Do you believe honor killings are justified if a culture accepts them?
Yes, in some societies, they are seen as acts of restoring family honor. Their legal systems reflect those values, and we do not have right to impose our standards.
So you are saying that murder is acceptable just because a culture allows it? That's exactly the problem with moral relativism. It lets oppression hide behind the tradition.
And moral universalism lets one worldview decide what is right and wrong to the entire world.
You're avoiding the question. If a woman is killed by her own family because she chose to marry someone they disapprove of, are you saying that is just a cultural difference?
What I'm saying is that real change comes within cultures. You can't enforce law or intervene without creating resentment and backlash. Look at history. Cultures reject imposed morality.
So we should just watch people suffering and do nothing. That's not respect, that's moral cowardice.
And this is respecting the sovereignty. Not every country or society is obligated to follow one moral code.
But there's one fundamental principle that should apply everywhere, which is basic human dignity.
And that principle means different things in different places. What you see as dignity might contradict deeply held cultural or religious belief.
But you know what? Religious belief is not a free pass to violate human rights.
What decides what a human right is? The West or the international organizations that is shaped by the Western ideologies?
Human rights are not a Western invention. They are about protecting individuals, no matter where they are from.
Then why do so many cultures reject your so-called universal values?
Because people in power benefit from the oppression, just like slave owners, they reject the abolition of slavery. That doesn't mean that slavery should have been tolerated.
You're comparing everything to slavery when cultures have moral reasoning behind their traditions. Not every difference is oppression.
So where do you draw the line? When does a cultural practice become unacceptable?
When the people within that culture decide it is no longer acceptable, not when outsiders force it upon them.
That's not good enough. If people are dying, being discriminated, or suffering against, waiting for cultural shift is an excuse for inactions.
And your solution is to dictate morality from the outside? That sounds more like moral imperialism than human rights.
It's not about control, it's about justice. We have an ethical responsibility to protect all people, regardless of where they are born.
And I argue that the best way to create change is by respecting cultural autonomy. Society evolve when they are ready, not when they are forced.
Time's up. Wow, that was an intense and passionate debate. Now let's move on to our closing statements. Each speaker will have 1.5 minutes to summarize their stance.
This debate boils down to one question: who decides morality? You argue for universal values, but whose value? Who gets to judge what is right and what is wrong? History has shown that culture must be allowed to shape their own moral codes. Forced universalism leads to resistant conflicts and cultural erasure. Change must be organic, not dictated. We do not condone harm, but we believe morality is context-dependent and that societies must navigate their own moral evolution.
If moral universalism were truly just, it would not need to be imposed. Cultures must be given the respect and space to evolve on their own terms. Universalism is idealistic, but in practice, it disrespects the diversity and autonomy. A pluralistic world requires us to accept different moralities, even when they challenge our own beliefs. And that is the reality of ethical discourse. Thank you.
So moral relativism is a convenient excuse for inaction in the face of injustice. When we say let cultures decide, we turn a blind eye to violations of basic human dignity. Progress has never come from passivity. It has come from standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. If we accepted moral relativism, we would still have slavery, apartheid, and gender oppression. We cannot afford to let harmful traditions persist in the name of cultural tolerance. Human rights must be universal.
So let me be clear, we are not attacking culture, we are just defending human life. Some things like murder, torture, discrimination are wrong, period. Moral relativism enables oppression, violence, and inequality. It allows for honor killings, FGM, and execution for being LGBTQ+ to continue unchallenged. We don't need to impose moral values, we need to stand by them. If we truly believe in human dignity, then morality cannot be optional. It must be universal. Thank you.
And that concludes our debate. Both teams have presented compelling arguments. We'll turn to our judges to evaluate the arguments and determine which side made the stronger case. We will have a short break in the meanwhile. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed judges and talented debaters, thank you for an incredible competition today. We have witnessed thought-provoking arguments, outstanding rebuttals, and a true display of intellect and eloquence. After careful deliberation, our judges have provided their insights on today's debate. They commended both teams for their depth of research, clarity of argumentation, and strategic rebuttals. Our supporting team was praised for their strong evidence-based reasoning, while the opposing team stood out with their persuasive delivery and quick counter-arguments. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for, the winner of today is our supporting team! The judges highlighted their well-structured argument, strong reasoning, and effective counter-arguments. Congratulations to our champions Mark Sidney and Wong Yong Ki for their outstanding performance. Let's give them a big round of applause. We also want to acknowledge our runners-up, our opposing team, for your incredible performances today. Though the results may not be in your favor this time, I hope you all can keep debating and come back stronger. Before we conclude, today's debate has underscored a critical point. While cultural differences exist, morality cannot be entirely relative. Universal moral principles provide a necessary foundation for justice, human rights, and ethical consistency across societies. The stance of universalism is not about dismissing cultures, but about ensuring that fundamental moral values such as fairness, human dignity, and the right to freedom are upheld regardless of location or tradition. Cultural differences should be respected, but they cannot override core moral truths that transcend individual societies. Universalism is not about erasing diversity, but ensuring that ethical standards remain consistent and just for all. This debate has reaffirmed that while we acknowledge diversity, core moral truths must transcend across cultural boundaries to create a just and equitable world. A huge thank you to all candidates, judges, and audiences who made this event possible. Regardless of the results, each of you has demonstrated skill, dedication, and the power of debate. We hope to see you again in the future competitions.
That's right. Audio chill.
Okay.
Okay.
什么？